Don't talk to me. I don't believe a word.
We're all here.
How's it going?
Going well.
We're rolling and rolling.
Yeah, man.
So this is our podcast, American Reckoning, and this is we like to say we tie in the last time Americans got pissed off enough to stand up against tyranny, and believe it or not, that wasn't 1776. That was 1861, and that's unfortunately when federalism and constitutional republic that we had died, April 1865. And but we explore the truth on this podcast and look at Confederate history, Confederate and Southern heritage, and we'll look at the truth and some of the lies that are out there. We kind of know a lot of this stuff to be self-evident, as we call it. But it's kind of a no woke zone. We talk about, there's plenty to agree or disagree with. We have, everybody has opinions, and that's a good thing. What we are not are a bunch of racists and, slavery loving white supremacist garbage that you hear out there constantly. We're Americans and we love our country. And I just wanted to make sure that when you see the Confederate flag or Confederate symbols and Confederate monuments out there, do not be afraid, because the people who are afraid are really pretty ignorant. And we try to dispel a lot of that on this podcast. So he's Aaron, I'm Paul, and we're going to talk about secession. And secession in its origins, and then through obviously the war between the states, the Civil War, and secession even today. Eventually, we're going to try to do this hopefully in two parts, right, Aaron?
Yep, we'll see how it works out, but
yeah, we'll try to do. We'll bring in a couple other guys that were in some of our other episodes, Todd and Bobby. We'll see with a part two, because there's so much material on secession that. But anyway, also don't forget, we're kind of new at this. We're kind of winging it, but we do have a little channel, American Reckoning channel on YouTube, and maybe we'll get out on Rumble here soon as we have the time. But our podcast is at American Reckoning, so you can search it and just subscribe to our channel on the little old button on there. So hopefully you can join and comment and do whatever you want. Keep it classy. But we like dissent and different opinions. So hey, man, talk about it. But I want to start off with this quote. This is from 1848. And this person became a hero in Washington, D.C., and there's a big old monument to him. And I wonder if you can guess who this is. But this quote was actually pretty accurate. And the quote goes, "Any people, whatever, being inclined and having the power, have the right to rise up." Revolution. I question, rise up. What does that mean? Is that revolution? And to have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is the most valuable and most sacred right, a right which we believe is to liberate the world. Well, that, of course, 1848, 12 years later, the war between the states started. But that was honest Abe Lincoln. So here he is right off the, as a in the Whig Party at the time, and he's all about rising up and shaking off, a government, a form of government that he only says that suits them better. He doesn't even say that's tyrannical or whatever. He just, yeah, you can walk away from this contract. You can walk away from this unholy union. It's your sacred right. But the opposite came to pass with Lincoln, and when the Southern states were trying to do it. And that's a big, that's pretty interesting.
Quite a discrepancy.
Yeah. You're saying something, either you're a big bald-faced liar or you're that stupid, or I don't really know. I mean, why would you?
Or you're a politician.
Yes. Oh, he's a legislator and a politician. We've got plenty of those.
Right.
These guys all of a sudden want to be presidents when they can't even tell the truth. How, we've got a whole bunch of that kind of corrupt nonsense. But,
well, and there's a whole interesting chapter of Lincoln's life before he was in national politics, when he was a lawyer for the railroads.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise that the railroads were such a priority even during the war while he was in office. He was a high paid lawyer for the railroads.
Yeah, and that continued during right through the war and during Reconstruction. That's all that money that was now, the South lost.
Mm-hmm.
So all those revenues, all that money went to the railroads up in the North for commerce and mercantilism and all that. So, but anyway, so we're what I want to do, we'll look at, I think, just kind of keep on this early secessionist, describing some of the, we asked, do you know that the United States, when we formed, it was by secession. I mean, the colonies and the people within the colonies were no longer as interested in being a part of the crown. King George III was a tyrant, and there was a monarchy of England, and where all rule was cast down. We had very little representation, if none, in the British Parliament and of any substance. So Jefferson stated in the Declaration of Independence, if there's, we have the right to secede from that government, as Lincoln stated in 1848. So he was fully on board, even though later on he would kind of change his tune. That doesn't, and Jefferson agreeing with secession and seeing the right to secede, that doesn't mean that Jefferson was not a strong defender of the Union, but a Union based on a constitution set by the people of the states. So later on in 1801, in his first inaugural address, Jefferson said that, quote, "If there's any among us who wish to dissolve this union or change republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it." So he was willing to tolerate secession, even if it meant error of opinion, which is a free speech issue. So, he was willing, to understand that if secession would come to a state and the state wanted to secede, it was not a great thing. It was not. But it was their right to. They can do so undisturbed. Let them stand undisturbed.
Well, and a quick point on that. Part of Jefferson's philosophy, and of course he wasn't perfect, but he actually had this idea that as territory would be gained and populations grew even within existing territories, that territories would start to break off on their own. Not basically peacefully seceding, and that actually happened. Virginia is known as the mother of states, exactly in that vein. And the Ohio territories and a lot of these and the Kentucky territory all split off from what were originally Virginia territories to become their own states. Way early on, and Jefferson kind of had this idea that this would continue on, as far as it could. And so he had this kind of I forget the ways people have referred to it, but that was the idea. So So that certainly was reflected in other things that he championed over the years.
Yeah. I mean, he went on to say, I mean, even in 1825, he continued to feel this way. And in some of the New England states were already attempting secession, as you know, I think in 1807 and during the War of 1812, of course, they were really, 1807 had to do with the Louisiana Purchase. Mm-hmm. They did not want, they looked at Jefferson as depriving, bringing new foreigners into the country, which I think there was a handful of Frenchmen. But anyway, during the War of 1812, they wanted to secede. And Jefferson said, let them go. If you're really that interested in seceding, then go ahead. So you already, very early on, the secession was constant in our amongst the states.
Right.
And you start
Jefferson
seeing
wasn't president during 1812. But yeah, a lot of those northern states were really being ornery. They were doing things like not putting their state militias into service when ordered by the president, and all those things during the war, and they continued to trade. And so yeah, that was a whole big mess. But yeah, Jefferson was right in saying go ahead and let him go. Too bad he wasn't still president then.
Yeah, I mean, he said it was like a calamity and a serious rupture, but
yeah,
still that they had the right to do so, because even back then the government was growing into what he called one of unlimited powers, and it was already starting to metastasize, which exceeded the powers given to it by the Constitution. And that was, so speaking of a New Englander, and I'm going to read something real quick in a second, but John Quincy Adams in 1839, he defended the right to secede. And he was, of course, a Yankee and a staunch Unionist. And he said in his speech celebrating, I guess, what's called the Jubilee of the Constitution, he defended the basic American right of secession by saying the link of union between the people of the several states of this confederated nation, after all, not in the right, but in the heart. If the day should ever come when the affections of the people of these states shall be alienated from each other, when the fraternal spirit shall give way to cold indifference, or collision of interests shall fester into hatred, the bands of political association will not long hold together, parties no longer attracted by the magnetism of conciliated interests and kindly sympathies, to part in friendship from each other than to be held together by constraint. Then will be the time for reverting to precedents which occurred at the formation and adoption of the Constitution, to form again a more perfect union by dissolving that which could no longer bind, and to leave the separated parts to be reunited by law of political gravity to the center. So he already was talking about, I mean, again, this is not far removed from the onset of the war between the states.
No, not at that time. Yeah.
I'll make one more comment from Thomas DiLorenzo's book, which is what I'm reading from the Real Lincoln, which is an incredible dissection of Lincoln and his, breaking down so many sources and quotes that are not seen in the public discourse today, or in schools, or in anything.
Unless you were his students.
Right. Certainly not even in conservative Republicans today don't even look at this that way, or talk show. But anyway, Alex de Tocqueville, who, by the way, the modern Mark Levin likes to quote quite a bit, in Democracy in America, he wrote that the Union was formed by a voluntary agreement of the states, and in uniting together, they have not forfeited their nationality, nor have they been reduced to the condition of one of the same people. If one of the states chooses to withdraw from that compact, it would be difficult to disprove its right of doing so. and the federal government would have no means of maintaining its claims directly either by force or right. So he's totally correct. And of course, we went on to Civil War. Just to maintain the Union, to save the Union, as Lincoln called it, cost us $650,000 in lives.
That's been
Really
revised upward. Actually, I think it's almost 100,000 more than that these days.
Yeah. I mean, it's just not to mention the psychological cost of war and the economic damage and the mistrust, the hatreds that still. Look, we have this massive union.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it later. I don't want to get too much into it because I know you want to talk about a couple things, but when we're talking about even today and bringing it back to American reckoning and why can't we secede? Why can't we secede? Any state. I mean, hell, California wants to get on out of here. And if California wants to go, or Massachusetts or New York or anybody else, we'll go. Well, if you want to mate with dogs and I don't want to get, but if you want to do whatever you want, go right ahead.
Well, these days they would have to get federal permission to do so because that was decided in the late 1860s. Texas v. White, I think, established that, secession was illegal, which, of course, was not at all really in evidence before the war, but it was rubber stamping an entire premise for a major cost that everyone had just gone through. But they said the federal government can kick states out if they want to. So really what would have to happen is you'd have to have a federal politician running on a, let California go platform or something like that, which would be interesting. But yeah. So that's an interesting point on modern secession.
Yeah.
And they do have a secession movement in California.
Yes, they do. I mean, and of course there's a constitutional convention, which of course does it legally by the Constitution, right. Meaning getting 2/3 and I think eventually 3/4 to ratify such a new formation in whatever form that may be. But
are you referring to the Convention of States movement?
Convention of States, yeah, that's one group, and I think they've got like already 19 or 20 states on board.
Yeah, that has a lot of potential, but I think it has as much potential to go wrong as it does to go right. Because the reason I say that is because the states can get on board and get the numbers they need to actually call the convention, but the convention's actually carried out by the Congress once they do, if I understand the fine print properly. And the problem with that is you have the same swamp dwellers that are basically part of the problem that'll be all of a sudden deciding something that people at that point would have had to go to great lengths to set in motion without their help, because it's something they won't do on their own anyway. So and not to antagonize or be pessimistic, but that certainly has its challenges. Anyway,
so you mentioned talking about some of the early other examples about secession. I
can go through those real quick.
Yeah, I think let's because I think it's important to nail down some specific points and dates and people, because not for because everybody loves history, but to put things in context as to how important this was and how pervasive it was early.
Well, yeah, and how secession was used as a political tool. Most of these are from author Phil Lee, but some of this certainly does overlap with things DiLorenzo has, I'm sure. Phil Lee points out at least 5, and there's actually have 6 points here. I think a couple of them might be related. Times when northern states use secession as part of their ways to put political pressure on the federal government when they wanted something done. The first one actually was right after the Revolutionary War in 1789, when basically, and I don't have a list of all the states that were threatening this, but it's known that Hamilton warned Washington that the northeastern states would secede unless the government agreed basically to assume an obligation to pay off the Revolutionary War debts. And obviously that ended up happening and they didn't secede, but that was certainly part of, it was fragile, the whole time up until the so-called Civil War. But it was particularly fragile in the beginning. People had just signed this thing and a lot of them had to be persuaded and a lot of them weren't too sure. And then, of course, you mentioned the Louisiana Purchase. That kind of stuff started in 1803, and the main motivation there is they feared the new territories would become states eventually, which they did, and they would reduce the influence of New England in the federal union, which they did when the time came. But they ultimately didn't secede over that. I've got a quote here from Connecticut Senator James Hillhouse. He said, the eastern states must and will dissolve the union and form a separate government, end quote, over this issue. And at the time, the position was endorsed by John Quincy Adams, future president at that time, Elbridge Gerry, Fisher Ames, Josiah Quincy III, John Pickering, and Judge Joseph Story. And Joseph Story is an interesting character in the early Union. Topic for another day. But 1807, the Embargo Act. New England was the major trading center at that time. And the Embargo Act had to do with the rising tensions between England and the United States at that time. And so but yeah, basically there was an embargo put in place and it got messy eventually. But this was during Madison's first administration. And New Englanders were very angry about that. As the War of 1812, they didn't want to put their militias into federal service. They continued to trade. They really didn't abide by the Embargo Act. They refused to put their militias into federal service when ordered by President Madison. So that was the Embargo Act. But they threatened secession. So then there comes the War of 1812, and then in 1815 the Hartford Convention came around, basically that the Hartford Convention, they were getting together because they weren't paying attention to the Embargo Act until they got blockaded in the latter stages of the War of 1812 themselves, and all of a sudden now they couldn't trade anymore. So they had a convention. They sent some emissaries to Washington to demand 5 additional amendments to the Constitution. I don't have a lot of details offhand on those, but they were basically unsuccessful because the war, by the time the delegation arrived, the war had ended. So they kind of just dropped it, sort of, went back home. Then 1845, Texas annexation. Let's see. Yeah, in 1843, Northeasterners, 12 congressmen, including then former President John Quincy Adams, signed a letter to the public stating that the annexation of Texas would not only result in the secession of the free states, but would also, quote, fully justify it. Very interesting. And then the last one of significance during the antebellum period was the Mexican War. And that's so that was 1846. Former New York governor and future Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, William Seward, wrote, "Free labor states cannot yield to Texas annexation. They would consider it grounds for secession, nullification, and disunion." So there you go. There's a guy who was Secretary of State under Lincoln himself, talking that kind of trash, and how quickly their tune changed when it was not politically expedient for them. But anyway, so those are several examples, and it's not like these were just one-offs. These people weren't just, these were major figures, and they were endorsed by major figures all over the place, is the point. This wasn't something that happened, in isolation. This was a tool that was regularly used, and it almost did happen in the North. And heck, Aaron Burr was involved in one of these somewhere, and I can't remember the exact connection, but of course he shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel and killed him.
Burr.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Burr. Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr. Yep. It's got your name.
Yeah.
He,
I don't know.
He popped Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, I don't know how much else we'd have in common, but
yeah, he's kind of but he was a secessionist, and
yep.
Interestingly enough,
Yeah.
and there's this other part about getting back to Lincoln on the verge of the war and justification, which speaks to secession. But he was talking about this notion that the federal union preceded the states, and that was justification for that was a justification against seceding states.
Yes.
That somehow the union preceded the states.
Right. Completely impossible.
And that's a complete, absolute lie.
It's one of those political assertions that just completely baseless. But he stood by that. He stood by that. He argued that the states were like counties under the federal government, and a lot of Lincoln champions today, who really aren't nearly as critical of him as we are, use that to justify his Lincoln's contextualization of the Declaration of Independence as a founding document, which it was not. That's the whole Proposition Nation argument, which I won't get into now. But yeah, Lincoln was just, and it really makes you wonder if he believed that. He may have, but he was a politician again, so he was saying what would help his politics at the time. I really don't think. He said or not.
So much of it was this rhetoric that he used, that it would destroy the republic, that it would I think that the federal government that would be supposedly destroyed by secession of the southern states if they proceeded along, and that the representative government would perish from the earth. I mean, that's just insanity. That's such hyperbole and all that. It's just
it was straight rhetorical trash talking.
But then people started to believe that.
Well, I mean,
and it's like, then it was like this. Of course, when the war started and kicked off because of this wrong-headed lie.
Yeah.
And this is what's so why people have to understand that there are consequences for an idiot who's a legislator who says things that are not true, that are contradicted, as we've just laid out from the very beginning of our founding. And then this fool, if you want to call him a fool, I think he's a monster and a tyrant, and was actually pretty smart.
Yeah, I think that's
politically speaking, and from a manipulative,
could probably be more easily
excused. A forked tongue, just like the bureaucrats that would go out to the reservations and the Indians, and another forked tongue bureaucrat.
Poison blankets.
And that's all he was.
Yeah,
a complete destroyer of the Constitution.
Yeah,
and a lover of that power, of that central authority, that central government that he thinks could rule things and make everything better, and all his corrupt people behind him, and at the time the Northeast states, but it's an equal opportunity employer.
Well, and he didn't come out of
idiot.
Right. He didn't come out of a vacuum either. It's it's not like he was the first guy to think about this. This kind of centralist thought had been going on since the founding. Ironically, one of the main centralizers, one of the main consolidationists, was Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, which of course are touted so much by a lot of people on the right these days as some of the main justifications, but for ratifying the Constitution, which, taken at face value, one could say maybe they are. However, Alexander Hamilton started working against it along with a lot of other people from the get-go. And then after him, kind of taking after him, was a guy named Henry Clay. He was a politician. Mm-hmm. And Henry Clay was the mentor to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln actually spoke at his funeral. And they were all these people that had these kind of centralizing ideas from the beginning. So like there was never like a golden age where everybody was just proud to have a nice federal republic and we're just cruising along just fine with it. No, from the beginning. I mean, the first Supreme Court of the Justice of the United States, John Marshall, he ruled that the states did not ratify the Constitution.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Even the British in 1883, I think the Treaty of Paris, they even spelled out each of the states. Right.
Each state was separately signed for as an independent entity.
Why would they tell such a lie?
They knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing.
They knew what they were doing.
A centralized, consolidated government was explicitly rejected at all the constitutional conventions, time and time again. Guys like Hamilton did not get their way, but there were a lot of closet monarchists out there. There are a lot of people who wanted to copy one of the most successful models in the world at the time, which was England. You know, it's an understandable argument. It would be understandable for someone to take that position, but they realized they weren't popular, and so they just started what continues today, more and more consolidation.
Yeah, I was just going to say it does not stop. It's like there's this kind of thinking people and this kind of thinking people, and never the twain shall meet. We're constantly in conflict. So I wanted to bring this up real quick because it speaks to Lincoln, and I don't want to continue to talk about Lincoln, but Lincoln is so tied to secession in this question. And this is James Ostrowski. He's a legal scholar, and it was pointed out in the book, The Real Lincoln. But he presents this experiment that illustrates kind of the absurdity of the notion that Lincoln's suppression of secession in the South, but that it was if you'd have to believe that the original states, these stipulations would have to have been agreed to. Okay, in this sort of thinking. And I'll list some of these here because it really is a stark thing. So the attendees of the Constitutional Convention, right, originally, which barely ratified the Constitution, they would have had to agree to the following. 1, no state may ever secede from the Union for any reason. Number 2, if any state attempts to secede, the federal government shall invade that state with sufficient military force to suppress the secession. The federal government may require all states to raise militias to be used to suppress the seceding state or states.
That's why Virginia seceded.
Right. After suppressing this, the federal government may rule by martial law until such time as a state accepts permanent federal supremacy, as occurred during Reconstruction, right?
Yep.
After the secession is suppressed, the federal government may force the states to adopt a new state constitutions imposed upon them by the federal military authority, which is what happened.
Yep.
The president may, on his own authority and without consulting any other branch of government, suspend the Bill of Rights and the writ of habeas corpus, as of course Lincoln did in the first months of his presidency, and arrested people who disagreed with him and threw them in jail. In the course of even congressmen,
and so, of course, none of them in the Constitutional Convention agreed to anything remotely like that, implied or otherwise.
No, or any amendments from that. I mean, this was, if you put it in the context and take away the emotion and the passions of the time, and they're seceding and slavery and you would notice that there's no way in hell.
Yeah.
That the delegates to the Constitutional Convention would have agreed to any of this. Yeah. And Lincoln basically did it anyway.
Yeah. Well,
that's how dangerous for rhetoric
he broke so many laws that he rightly should have been impeached, and they were almost criminal. I mean, they resulted in criminal acts, that's for sure. But
everybody calls the Southern states treasonous and traitors. No, there's only one traitor. And that's the person who initiated war and invaded these states that was unconstitutional and suspended the rule of law for his own purposes. That is a traitor. You may say what you want about, throwing in the emotionalness of slavery and all this, but this was a much bigger question to deal with constitutional issues, and he was a usurper of the Constitution, of our rights, of the state's rights.
I don't think most people realize the number of very, very dangerous precedents that were set by Lincoln during his administration. I mean, even now, you could say, all right, they were a bunch of, treacherous southern states, if you believe that. But the truth is, just look what he did to Northerners. Look at all the newspapers. He had the army go and shut down. Look at all these civilians. He look at the congressmen he imprisoned. Look at the head. Heck, he put the head of the chief justice under house arrest. When the chief justice said that he can't, suspend habeas corpus. I mean, if any president did anything like that today, people, all over the place would be screaming bloody murder. And people did back then, but information didn't travel quite as fast, or and I don't know what they would have been able to do in the context of the time if it did, but yeah, I mean, just the stuff he did, it's amazing how much of a complete dictator a president can be and say, I'm still not going as far as Lincoln did, Very interesting thing to say. And it was outrageous, and it was committed against just forget about the South, the North. And they complained all about this. And it wasn't just him, he delegated it to our army officers, to go and,
they were
arbitrarily, they could under him, they could go and suspend habeas corpus and say, all right, the law didn't apply to you. That's been suspended or whatever. And, but yeah, you
can see, actually, I think in one of the other episodes here, where that type of authority exceeded even Lincoln's when they started, when a couple of the generals, David Hunter and I can't remember the other general, but they started freeing slaves.
Oh yeah,
in their territories, and it's like, well, actually, you can't do that.
Yeah, well, Lincoln rescinded those, and of course, there were a lot of slave owners who were still loyal to the Union, and some who even supported Lincoln, believe it or not. And they were outraged when some Union generals would come in and destroy their plantation. They're like, "I've been supporting you the whole time." They didn't care. So yeah, I mean, the real motivations. War is always ugly, but the real motivations are really the point here,
Right. And speaking of, and that's what the hoping to avoid that war, and the secession question being so vital. And that's why it's important to point these things out. It's like, look, man, you're getting ready. You're having what they call a civil war, which wasn't. It was a war between the states. This was a states issue. And we'll talk about in part 2, Todd will talk a little bit about the 10th Amendment and some of the constitutional aspects here. But and then we'll talk a little bit more about what secession means today and what states want to secede, because it's an issue even today. It's a constitutional matter. And, I bring up this because any contract has an out. Okay. It's not like the mafia where you've got a gun to your head. Either you'll have your signature on this or your brains will be on the form or whatever. You have an out. You have 30 days, 60 days, whatever, but we want out. Think of a divorce. If you're in an abusive situation and you can't get, what are you going to do? I mean, nobody likes divorce, right? Nobody likes to break a contract. No one likes secession, because you formed the contract under great possibilities and potential, and you have a list of things that mutually agreed upon. But when someone breaks that agreement, when someone defaults on that repeatedly, even, you cannot stay in that contract.
Well, I might point out also that there was specific language for perpetual union in the Articles of Confederation. that was removed and
That
not
was
part
removed,
of the Constitution. And keep in mind also that the Bill of Rights, which people on, whether you're on the left or the right, there's a lot in the Bill of Rights that everybody likes. Keep in mind that would not have existed if it weren't for the people who were against signing the Constitution, the anti-federalists, guys
Right.
like George Mason. The Federalists argued that the Bill of Rights was unnecessary because because
the union's perfect
in other words, no protection is necessary because clearly the federal government has no power on any of these grounds, was their argument. Now,
right. Yeah.
Thank God that point of view did not gain any ground or prevail. But
Virginia
yes.
and you give credit to New York, I think Rhode Island and we're smart to say no. Actually, that's a recipe waiting.
Yep.
That disaster situation coming.
Absolutely. And there was kind of an understanding that existed in that generation of what was going on. That's long since been lost. Historians can get close to it. You can read a lot of primary source material and see what they're kind of all angling for. But secession was something that was certainly spoken of and certainly endorsed by people all over on all sides of the founding generation. So, and for good reason too.
I want to talk briefly here about more arguments that Lincoln made against secession, and he brought up this that secession would lead to anarchy, that majority rule was in deep conflict with the understanding of the role of majority rule in the federal system and other founders of the American government. But if you think about it, and that's another lie, because the way our system of government is, we talk about, in a federal system, you have federal, state, you have local governments, you have counties, and so on, all kinds of these different governmental jurisdictions that are based on the preferences of the people in those areas. So the point being is that you can't destroy majority rule, as Lincoln contended, because you can take your vote to another state. You don't have to live in that community or that county or that state. You can go to another state. So that's absurd. So again, here's Lincoln lying, using this huge amount of hyperbole speech that people buy in without thinking. And he's using that for justification against secession, which eventually is to usher in the American system, as he thought, which was a continuation of the Henry Clays and the Daniel Websters and everybody else in the American system. But, it's the people have a chance to get up. I mean, you see this today. People come to Florida all the time.
Yeah.
They see, oh, I'm not paying 7% income tax in New York or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or wherever state they are, or not to mention the local tax, the property tax, all kinds of taxes on top of that before you're paying 30, 40, even 50% of your taxes are going to the state. Well, no way. I'm sick of New York. I'm going down to Florida. Unfortunately, They bring their politics too, but you have the ability, a free person in a free state, to move to another state.
Right. Move to a different set of
that
rules.
That becomes too much for you. It's inconvenient. It's not something you want to do. But Lincoln said that would, yeah. So very wrong-headed. And
Lincoln is so deified now. And there was a book written in the 1940s. I think I've got it somewhere. It's called The Deification of Lincoln. That's where an author talked about how basically upon his assassination, everybody who in the North who didn't like him all of a sudden started praising him to high heaven. And just all kinds of outrageously, so the whole point is today he's he's deified, and so anything he ever said is taken as gospel, without any context for which he said it, in which he said it, or anything, or even with an understanding of what of his particular popularity at the time. I mean, he didn't win with the majority of the vote even in the North. He didn't appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. This was not a very popular guy. And a lot of what he was talking about was considered even radical for the time, and that is evidenced by what northern politicians said about him, which, of course, he was able to silence effectively when he became president. But
yeah, and we're gonna talk more about secession. I want to read this quote that came out of Boston on the eve of the war, March 18th, 1861, right? And the newspaper wrote this regarding secession. It does not require extraordinary sagacity to perceive that trade is perhaps the controlling motive operating to prevent the return of the seceding states to the Union. So it's written in here that the alleged grievances about slavery, but believe that the quote, the mask has been thrown off, and it is apparent that the people of the principal seceding states are now for commercial independence. So even the top commercial people, in Boston, for example, in the newspaper, recognized the economic matter here, which was what the war was about. It's always about that. So, but it, speaking on behalf of secession and sort of completely agreeing and not seeing it. Of course, this is March 18th, 1861. They would change their tune probably very shortly after that, once bullets started flying and men started being calling up from their towns. Then you get on the bandwagon. Then you get on the Lincoln train. And then our country basically transforms into away from what it was intended to do. So I think we can there's so much on secession. We can sit here and continue
this is
on
the
and
first
on.
little this is the first nice little foray into it, I think.
Yeah. So I think we'll continue on the next episode. But this American Reckoning, and we'll go ahead and close out on this episode. And but don't forget to subscribe to @American Reckoning on the YouTube channel, and hopefully you guys keep on listening. We'll be back soon. So thanks for joining us.
All right.
See you, man.